Think that government stooge Walter Peck in the film Ghostbusters might actually have been in the right? This video will try to convince you otherwise. In the years since Ghostbusters went on to become a cinematic classic, some have reconsidered the actions of the film's human antagonist, Walter Peck. In light of the behavior of Bill Murray's abrasive Peter Venkman, the argument has been made that Peck was maligned by the film, and Venkman is responsible for the disaster that Peck would later cause solely because of his jackassery. While we, as always, applaud critical thinking and not accepting that the main character is right simply because they're the main character, in this case, Venkman remains righteous, and Peck is still a jerk. Here's 4 reasons that people argue that Peck was right, and why both they and he was in the wrong. Number 1. Venkman provoked Peck into what he did. While Venkman didn't help Peck's disposition, Peck was equally willing to screw with Venkman. In fact, his entire purpose in being there was to screw with Venkman. But more on that in a second. Right out of the box, Peck questions whether Venkman qualifies for being a doctor. And the answer to that question is, he has a doctorate. In fact, he has 2 doctorates. But then, having established his credentials, Peck then immediately shows his lack of respect by refusing to call him doctor, deliberately and repeatedly calling him Mr. Venkman the entire conversation. The point is clear. Peck does not respect either Venkman or the work that he does. Venkman responds by being disrespectful right back. And sure, he could have taken the high road, but why should he? Especially given Peck's reason for being there. Number 2. Peck was just doing his job. Peck works for the Environmental Protection Agency. That doesn't have any bearing on what the Ghostbusters are doing. Someone might say, well, they flat out admit their proton packs are an unlicensed nuclear accelerator, which is true. But that's not a concern of the EPA. That's a concern of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They're not disposing of nuclear material either. It's just that their packs are nuclear, and the government can be a bit twitchy about that kind of thing. But the accusation had nothing to do with their proton packs and everything to do with chemicals, either as the principal element or as the result of their activities. And the reason for that is because that kind of thing the EPA would be handling. So the one thing you can argue that they should be investigated for had nothing to do with what Peck was there to investigate. This is important because, number 3, Venkman could have just cooperated instead of making things worse. Peck had no reason to investigate them in the first place. The Ghostbusters don't do any manufacturing, and there are no records indicating large-scale chemical purchases, which we know because the work the Ghostbusters do doesn't involve large amounts of chemicals. Any chemicals that they would have purchased would be typical of what you'd have in any science lab, something numerous companies would have for their R&D purposes, so there would be nothing unusual about it. That's why Venkman was suspicious with Peck right from the get-go. Peck came in to inspect the place, and the only justification he had for it, the only thing at all, was, quote, wild stories in the media. This, combined with the other 2 things, made it clear to Venkman that there was no way he was going to satisfy Peck, because Peck came here looking for something to use against him. It was in Venkman's best interest not to cooperate, because cooperation would at best convince Peck that he was hiding something, and at worst, give him something to manufacture a false case against them. And Venkman knew this because when Peck said that he would come back with a court order, Venkman immediately responded with no jokes, simple, serious threats that this was wrongful prosecution. Malicious prosecution laws exist for exactly this kind of situation, when someone is abusing the legal system with malicious intent. If Peck pushed through his court order, it'd be backed up based on insubstantial, if not outright false, information. If Venkman had cooperated, on the other hand, he could have potentially handed Peck misinformation to use to try to back up his justification. 4. Peck may have been wrong about what happened, but he thought he was doing the right thing. Well, he may have, but even he knew that he was full of it when he was talking to Venkman. How do we know that? Because when he shows up with his court order, what does he bring with him? He brought a police officer and one workman with a hard hat. If you are on a site that you suspect has, quote, noxious, possibly hazardous waste chemicals, this is not the crew you show up with. You show up with people in hazmat suits trained to handle dangerous chemicals. The fact that he didn't show up with any proves that he showed up knowing he wasn't going to find any chemicals and was basing his entire argument on the contents of his ass. So the truth about Walter Peck is, he was not a guy doing his job, trying to protect the citizens of New York from the environmental threat of these careless men who were thwarting his efforts for their personal amusement. He was someone abusing his power to try to take down legitimate businessmen and willing to mislead the courts in order to do it, while showing open contempt for them. It is true, this man has no dick. Walter Peck is likely a deliberate narrative choice, because, as I said, the NRC would have had a legitimate beef with the Ghostbusters. The use of the EPA wasn't to criticize the work that the EPA does, as Harold Ramis himself supported environmentalism enough to appear in an Earth Day special, and using the Ghostbuster persona to help with that. The use of the EPA was instead to show a government bureaucrat trying to stick it to the little guy, while the little guy refuses to take it. It's slobs versus snobs, which is a common theme in Harold Ramis's work. Walter Peck is the guy who shows up in his fancy suit lording his big government authority over others, in contrast to Peter Venkman, who, despite having 2 doctorates, is still a working-class stiff trying to help his little company stay in the black. The confrontation between the two shows Venkman's vital role to the Ghostbusters. While Egon and Ray have the book smarts in order to handle the ghostbusting, Venkman's skills are knowing people. He was the one who understood well enough what Peck was doing and why he needed to stop him. He just chose to have a little fun while doing it. And unlike Walter Peck, wasn't going to misuse the justice system to do it.